Hey everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 67th episode of the Writ Podcast. It's the U.S. midterms on Tuesday, and the polls are suggesting that while the Republicans are pretty likely to take control of the House, the Senate could turn out to be very, very close. So joining me today to set up the U.S. midterms and also talk a little bit about how American and Canadian elections maybe compare and contrast, I'm joined by senior elections analyst Nathaniel Rakich from FiveThirtyEight. Nathaniel, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, Eric, it's great to be here. I am a longtime fan and listener of the Writ.
Well, I know that you follow our politics too, which is why I really wanted to talk to you. But before we get into the election results and sort of how the contest is shaping up, I do feel like we should probably talk about a little bit what's at stake in these elections. You know, watching here from Canada, our politics can be a little bit more staid, let's say, than what we see in the U.S. You know, there's lots of polarization right now in the United States, in the media, in politics, conspiracy theories, election denial of results. You know, what happened with the husband of Nancy Pelosi just recently. So it feels like there's a lot more at stake in this election than just, you know, whether the red team or the blue team is going to come out ahead.
Yeah, welcome to the U.S., everyone. Yeah, so I guess to kind of take a step back, so, you know, this is a midterm election in the U.S., right? So it's not a presidential election, but basically everything other than the presidency is on the ballot. So the U.S. Senate, only 1/3 of the seats, but control is obviously on the line. The entire U.S. House, and then governorships and state legislatures and other local offices in the state. So it's basically like you're having a parliamentary election and a provincial election all together on the same day. And so, yeah, because of that, a lot is at stake. So, you know, obviously currently Democrats have full control of government in Washington, D.C., just barely. They have a 50-50 Senate with the Vice President, Kamala Harris, breaking the tie. But that could change, obviously, if Republicans take control of either branch of Congress. You'd be looking at divided government, which I think would kind of reset the Biden administration and make it so that it'd be a lot harder for him basically to pass policies through the traditional legislative manner. You'd probably see a lot more kind of executive action. You've already kind of seen that with certain things, like he recently he took action to forgive student debt, for example. But a lot of the stakes, I think, that are the highest are on the state level. So lots of states, you know, because the governor and the state legislature is up, you know, you could see either Republicans or Democrats take full control of the state legislatures, of state government. And that means that they could basically make whatever policies they want. And this is, you know, particularly, I think, heightened because of the recent decision by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, the constitutional right to an abortion. So that means that states are now free to make their own abortion laws, for example. So this is a big thing that's in stake in states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, for example, North Carolina. Michigan is actually, so in addition to all these offices, we also have ballot measures on the ballot. And so Michigan has a ballot measure that's going to decide whether abortion is protected in the state. So in addition to kind of who wins and can make policy in those states, you're also going to have that ballot measure. In terms of other stuff, you mentioned certainly election denialism. So the way that elections work in the U.S. is very decentralized, as folks probably know. It happens on the state level. A state kind of, you know, elects electors to the Electoral College that then get sent off to vote indirectly for president. And so there is a lot of concern that if certain Republicans who have said that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump win key election administration or certification posts in these states, there's kind of an open question as to whether they could, you know, in 2024, if Joe Biden or whoever the Democratic nominee for president is wins that state again, are they going to certify that result? Are they going to treat that as legitimate? And really, we don't know what would happen in that case. Certainly, there would be court fights. You know, we kind of saw this in 2020. Donald Trump had a very scattershot strategy for challenging the results of the election. That election really wasn't close because even if you could succeed at overturning the results in one state, Joe Biden had won in Arizona and Pennsylvania Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Georgia. And so, and a lot of the legal arguments there were very haphazard and kind of slapped together at the last minute. But if you have kind of some of these election deniers already in place, again, kind of refusing to certify maybe the results of an election, that could throw the outcome into legitimate doubt in a state. It would not be pretty for U.S. democracy. And so some states
and that includes a lot of close states, right? Like Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
Arizona.
exactly. That's kind of what where the action is focused. So the Secretary of State is the name of the position that administers election in most states. So Arizona and Nevada, I think, are the two states to look at in terms of those are two states where the Republican candidate for Secretary of State has said that the 2020 election was stolen. There are states that are likely to be close in 2024 as well. Pennsylvania is another one where the Republican candidate for governor who appoints the Secretary of State, so they would work together to administer the 2024 election. He actually attended the January 6th riot outside the Capitol building. He's a big-time election denier as well. His name is Doug Mastriano, but he is probably going to lose. So the competitive races are more in Nevada and Arizona.
Yeah, because here in Canada, of course, as you know, we have Elections Canada that runs the election across the country. The last time that we had elections where the rules were based on whatever was in a province, I think, was in the 1870s. So we have moved on a little bit from that. And it is an odd concept to think that election laws should be different from one state or the other when you're talking about federal offices. But I guess when you are also voting for the local governor, the local legislature, maybe it makes sense because we do have different election laws in our provincial elections. But I guess that is what happens when you combine these federal and provincial vote or state votes at the same time.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just kind of the nature of the United States, right? We've always kind of had this idea of, states can make their own laws to a certain extent, going all the way back to the Articles of Confederation. I know you're a history nerd, Eric. I don't know if other folks are boned up on their American history, but yeah, we just have a more decentralized system of government.
Okay, well, let's get into some of these races because there's a lot. There's just a lot of voting going on because it is in every congressional district. There is an election. There is, as you said, in a third of the Senate seats. So let's start with the House. Now, the polls are suggesting that the Republicans are pretty likely to pick it up, and historically that has been the case. But what is there to watch in the House race?
Yeah, exactly. So we at FiveThirtyEight, we aggregate the polls, as folks probably know. We also put out our forecasts for every district and also kind of the chambers as a whole. So if you look at our House forecast right now, we think that Republicans have an 85% chance of winning the House. So that seems like, it's not a done deal, of course, 15% chance things do happen. But it would be quite a surprise at this point for Democrats to hold control of the House. In terms of things to watch, I mean, because it looks like Republicans are going to have a fairly big cushion there. A lot of the individual districts probably, I probably don't want to bore people with just being like, oh, Virginia's second district, this is the one to watch. But yeah, that's it looks like a little that's the one that I would put more money on for sure.
So with the House, the Republicans have moved ahead in terms of the congressional ballot kind of thing, right? Where in the past they not necessarily have needed to be ahead in the popular vote in order to win control of the House, right?
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So there's a type of poll. I guess it's basically what you guys have, right? The generic congressional ballot, which is pollsters will obviously we have 435 House districts, and there's a different candidate in each one. But pollsters will often poll the entire nation and just ask, are you voting for the Democratic or Republican candidate? And so Republicans currently have a small lead in this average of generic congressional ballot polls. But yeah, they don't necessarily need that because, in the U.S. we also have this fun thing called gerrymandering, which is that, speaking of kind of balkanized control of government, each state gets to decide how they draw their congressional lines. And there are independent commissions in some states, but most states use a political process, right? They pass a new map through the legislature and the governor signs it. And if the legislature is controlled by Democrats or Republicans, then you're going to get a map that favors Democrats or Republicans. And right now, overall in the House, you are basically the maps are slightly biased toward Republicans because Republicans have control of more state governments than Democrats do. And so they were able to draw more congressional districts than Democrats were. The bias is small. It's not insurmountable. Republicans have had this bias basically ever since 2010, which was a really strong election year for Republicans and was also a U.S. Census year, which meant that the line drawing happened immediately after that. But obviously Democrats were able to take control of the House in 2018 and 2020 despite this bias. But it does help Republicans on the margin if you had kind of a perfectly even if the national popular vote were exactly tied for the House, you would see Republicans take a narrow majority because the kind of median or tipping point district in the House does lean slightly Republican.
Is that largely because of the boundaries, or is it because of the kind of political geography? Because here, if we're talking about our federal elections, the Liberals and the Conservatives, if the Liberals are tied with the Conservatives, they probably win more seats because they don't run up as big numbers in parts of the country as Conservatives do. Is it the same thing in the United States, or is it primarily the gerrymandering?
Yeah, it's definitely a mix of both. There's debate about which one is kind of more to blame, but I kind of think that we don't need to waste time arguing about that because clearly both are to blame. As you mentioned, the Democrats obviously are concentrated in cities, and Republicans dominate in rural areas. And in general, when you're drawing, these lines, and we have some states like Wyoming, which only has one congressional district, and so the entire state is red, and which in America is the Conservative Party, the Republicans. And so, there's no way that you can kind of get a Democratic seat out of that, for example. And so, yeah, that does contribute as well. But also it's clear if you break down some of the maps in a place like Florida or Texas, they're clearly drawn in a way that gives Republicans disproportionately more seats than they would kind of normally be entitled to.
You mentioned it, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but the blue versus red I find is an interesting thing because I think for Canadians especially, we see American elections so much that when we think of red state versus blue state, that means something to us. But I do sometimes wonder if Americans ever see the map of the UK or Canadian elections and see the red versus blue, and there's a little cognitive dissonance there for Americans looking at the way that we color our parties.
I do think it is very confusing for a lot of Americans. But of course, the red-blue thing in the United States is fairly new. It really only kind of happened after the 2000 election when, as far as I can tell, it was just CNN and other news networks just decided to use red for Republicans and blue for Democrats, and it caught on. But yeah, obviously, traditionally you see, blue, is the color of a more conservative party. So there is actually a small underground movement on elections Twitter here in the U.S. to switch back. One of the kind of premier, election data sites, Dave Leap's Political Atlas, uses blue for Republicans and red for Democrats, which is always something that needs to be kind of explained to people using it for the first time.
Yeah, and I guess if we're really getting into the weeds, if you go to Europe, Liberal Party is usually yellow, and we have them as red. Anyway, so we're getting way into the weeds. Okay, let's get into the Senate, because the Senate is really what is going to be the main focus on election night, because that is really what's up for grabs. As you mentioned, it is deadlocked right now, so it doesn't need to have a lot of change in the Senate in order for one party or the other to take control. So first of all, what are the states that are going to decide it? Because it isn't going to be all 35 that are, or 36 or whatever it is. I don't know the exact number, but it's going to be only come down to 4, 5, 6 states, right?
Right, exactly. So yeah, the Senate is basically as close as you can get. So it's already 50-50. And in the 538 forecast, it's a toss-up right now. So we have Republicans with a 54% chance of winning control and Democrats with a 46% chance of getting control, which, of course, is basically functionally equivalent to a coin flip. But yeah, I think that you could basically, if you told me the results in 3 states, I could tell you who won the Senate. And those states are Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Nevada. So Georgia and Nevada are both Democratic-held seats currently. They're held by fairly strong Democratic incumbents, but they're kind of swimming against the partisan tides of the states somewhat, because these are slightly red states normally, even though Joe Biden won them, but also just kind of the year and the national environment being, not not great for Democrats. And so Republicans obviously would only have to win one of those seats in order to take a 51-49 advantage in the Senate. But then Republicans are also defending a seat in Pennsylvania. You have the Republican incumbent there who is retiring, and this is a race between the Democratic Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and then also Dr. Mehmet Oz, who folks might know is kind of this famous television physician who, when he jumped into the race, everybody's like, wait, that Dr. Oz, he's running for Senate? He's a Republican candidate. And so if Democrats lose one of Georgia or Nevada, they could still remain in control if they were to also flip Pennsylvania. It would be a wash in that case. But all three of those races are very competitive. I think right now in our forecast, they're all considered toss-ups as well.
And they're also they're interesting races, right? Because as you mentioned, you got Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania with John Fetterman, who had a stroke a few months ago, which is a big question there. And then you have in Atlanta with Herschel Walker and Warnock. That is also a little bit of a interesting contest in terms of the characters involved.
Yeah, exactly. So Raphael Warnock he won a special election for this seat, a by-election basically, in 2020, and this was actually the race that gave Democrats control of the Senate. So he kind of became a Democratic celebrity, and as I mentioned, he's a very strong candidate. He's raised a ton of money, but his opponent is also very famous. It's Republican Herschel Walker, who is a former football player, led the University of Georgia to a national championship in the 80s. Went on to the National Football League, but he has really been beset by a lot of scandals. So he's not a politician, right? He is this sports player who was basically like pulled out of retirement by Donald Trump to run because of his kind of mythic standing in Georgia. But it's come out since he started running, he has all sorts of skeletons in his closet. So he's had domestic violence allegations against him from his ex-wife. It turns out he's fathered multiple children out of wedlock. He most recently, it was reported that he or paid for his ex-girlfriend to get an abortion when she was pregnant in 2009, even though his position now as a Republican is to ban abortion in most cases. And so a lot of folks saw that as hypocritical. So there have been a lot of negative ads against him, and also just about generally his kind of unpreparedness to lead and to be a kind of quote-unquote serious politician, considering his total lack of not just kind of experience in elected office, but also to this point, apparently no interest in politics itself.
And so aside from, so we got Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania are very close ones. Are there any sort of stretch states that, if it becomes a very good night for the Republicans or good night for the Democrats, that are also worth watching?
Yeah, for sure. So Arizona is one state that I think at the beginning of the election year, people thought was going to be competitive, and it still is competitive, but it clearly leans toward Democrats. You have another strong Democratic incumbent there, Mark Kelly. He's a former astronaut. He's also raised a ton of money. His opponent, Republican Blake Masters, is not super strong of a candidate, also fairly inexperienced. He's young. He's in his 30s. He's like basically my age. Not that you can't be a senator if you're in your 30s, but yeah, it's a little bit of a mismatch in terms of candidate quality. On the other side, Democrats do have a couple of kind of outside shots at picking up Senate seats that are currently held by Republicans in 3 states. So that would be Ohio, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. But those are all, I think, pretty clear. Like, Republicans have a clear edge. It's not like outside the margin of error or anything like that. But it would be fairly surprising if Republicans lost those seats.
And for the Republicans, are there ones that if they get not just 1 or 2 seats that give them control of the Senate, but start to get into the 53, 54 range where that control is pretty comfortable?
Yeah, I mean, after Arizona, probably the most likely state to tip is New Hampshire, followed by Colorado. But yeah, at that point in kind of these days, as kind of politics has realigned a little bit in the era of Donald Trump and after that, states like New Hampshire and Colorado, which are fairly well college educated, which is a constituency that has moved toward Democrats, they've kind of come off the table a little bit. They're still kind of on the edge of competitiveness. And if we do see a kind of quote unquote red wave where Republicans do significantly better than we're expecting them to do, then those states could fall to Republicans and, as you say, kind of give them, 54 Senate seats or whatever. But, I think the strong likelihood is that this is going to be a, 1 or even 0 seat majority in the end for whichever party it is.
If when we're seeing these results coming in on election night, and we'll talk a bit later about whether we'll actually know what the results will be on election night, but are the results kind of correlated? Because that's one of the things, like with the House, it is more, I would think that, a rising tide lifts all boats pretty evenly. But in the Senate, you have much more of a statewide race where the candidates are really important. So if the Democrats do well in Georgia, does that mean that they're going to do well in Nevada? How related are these results?
Yeah, exactly. They're pretty related. So there is some debate about this. I tend to be more on the side of it's going to be 80-90% national factors and kind of the rising or falling national tide, as you mentioned. But yeah, there is certainly room for candidate quality to matter. I would say that kind of baseline partisanship and kind of the mood of the country is most important in the House. I think you could basically predict how 95% of the seats will vote based on how they voted for president in 2020. But in the Senate, like the candidates matter. You're seeing these people on TV ads. In the House, there are sometimes TV ads run, but you're less likely to know who your local congressman is versus your senator. And then the races that are kind of the least correlated with kind of federal political outcomes in the presidency are governor's races. So that's really a time when you can see a gubernatorial candidate make a brand for themselves. They can say, I'm not going to DC to be part of the national Republican or Democratic Party. I am my own type of Democrat or Republican. So that's how you've seen states like Massachusetts and Maryland and Vermont, which are very Democratic states normally, but they have recently elected Republican governors who are quite moderate and would probably be Democrats in other states. And you also see states like Kansas, which is a very Republican state, elect a kind of a more conservative Democratic governor in Laura Kelly. And that's actually one of the gubernatorial races that I would recommend watching in terms of, seeing whether partisanship is becoming a stronger and stronger force in American politics. We know that it is, but the question is, are we going to get to the point where all these elections are basically predetermined by presidential partisanship, or is there room for a kind of moderate with their own kind of independent brand to swim against the tide, especially in gubernatorial races and to some extent Senate races?
You mentioned Kansas one to watch. Are there any other at the governor level, state level, that are worth keeping an eye on just in terms of longer term impact, but just races that are really close right now?
Yeah, so a very close race is in Oregon. That's actually a three-way race between a Democrat, a Republican, and an independent. So that's made that race interesting. And then Arizona is another really interesting one. This is one where the Republican candidate there, Carrie Lake, is another kind of strong believer that the 2020 election was stolen. And so there's a lot of concern about if she's elected and she can take a role in the certification of Arizona's 2024 election, what she would do there. But you also have the Democratic candidate, Katie Hobbs, she's actually the current Secretary of State. So she administered the 2020 election, and fairly. And, she has experience being elected there. But she's refused to debate her opponent, which has caused some consternation, I think. And so that's, I think, probably going to be one of the most closely watched gubernatorial races. We mentioned Pennsylvania as well, but that one, the stakes there are high, but it's looking like the Democrats are going to win there. So,
okay. I wanted to talk a little bit now that we've gone through some of the races, a little bit about the U.S. versus Canada kind of political situation, because as I mentioned, I know you observe our politics as well. First of all, we're talking about races that are close and the ability of voters to move around. In Canada, as you know, we've had elections where you see enormous swings in support for one party or the other, right? Where a party can drop from 35% to 20% in the course of just a few weeks. And in the United States, when we're talking about polling, usually when you get to the last 2 or 3 weeks, a lot of this is already locked in. So how many voters in the United States are actually swinging around? Because here, there can be a lot. But in the United States, it doesn't seem there's that many.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, there aren't that many. I would say that probably only about maybe 10% of the electorate is a true swing voter, and that they would actually vote for a Democrat one year and a Republican the next, maybe. If you ask people, are you a Democrat, Republican, or an independent, it'll break down roughly one third, one third, one third. But a lot of those independents are people who, like to tell themselves they're independents, but they vote for Democrats or Republicans almost 100% of the time. So yeah, it didn't used to be this way, right? Used to be a lot more persuadable voters back in, the latter half of the 20th century. But again, kind of polarization has become really arguably the strongest force in American politics over the last, decade plus. How you vote for president is really going to determine most of your vote. And I do think part of that is, we have obviously only two major parties, and you guys have, multiple. And, especially with, kind of the liberals and the NDP, right? Like, you could easily imagine people switching between those parties, certainly depending on what riding you live on, and like, is the NDP or the liberal, like, kind of the gonna like do better, and you might strategic vote in that way. And like, because we have these two parties and they are very far apart on the issues, to the extent that, there is this partisan animosity between the two, right? The Democrats and Republicans view each other as the enemy. You see all these polls that say, I would not be okay if I'm a Democrat and if my daughter married a Republican, I would not be okay with that. And it leads to things like, you mentioned the attack on Paul Pelosi, certainly the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Obviously, the U.S. has a real problem with polarization kind of verging into violence, but it does make it that people are really dug into their respective camp, and there just isn't another party, that you can switch your vote to, even if you're maybe not thrilled with your choice. So like a great example, I think, is in Georgia, where there are probably a lot of Republicans, and actually Pennsylvania. Mehmet Oz is not popular there. He's had kind of issues because he's originally from New Jersey and kind of just moved to Pennsylvania a year ago to run for Senate, basically. And so in those states, if you're a Republican, you may not love Mehmet Oz or Herschel Walker, but you don't have a choice. You don't have another party you can go to and have your vote still matter. And when you're looking at DC and you see Joe Biden, who presumably is somebody you don't like and you think needs to be stopped in terms of making American policy more liberal, you're going to hold your nose and you're going to vote for Oz or Walker because they are the ones who are going to give Republicans the majority they need to block those policies.
Yeah, the ability to win control of the Senate becomes so important because you have, a role in choosing Supreme Court justices and nominating cabinet members. So, like, it does make you have to decide whether you care more about your, the local person or these broader things in terms of who's going to control the government, right? And in these states, we're only talking about a handful of states, right? So it's not like, in a congressional election for the Congress or for the House, I should say, or for the House of Commons here, where one seat's probably not going to make the big difference.
Right, exactly. Yeah, most states are solidly Democratic or solidly Republican, so we're really only talking about 10% of voters in 10% of states.
The midterms themselves are something that are pretty unique, right? In the United States, you have elections every 2 years, and so every 2 years there's an off cycle kind of election where it isn't aligned with the presidential election. And that is something that is just very different from what we have here, because if you win a majority government, you have the next 4 years, you don't need to worry about losing control. But here you can actually have where you'll lose control of the legislative branch of the government and you still have a president from the other party. Here, that would never happen, right? If you lose control of the legislative branch, you've lost control of the government, we have another election. So what impact do you think that has on politics itself?
Yeah, it's kind of a silly system when you think about it. So yeah, we have these presidential elections every 4 years and the midterm elections every 4 years, at the halfway point in the president's term. And we have this thing that's called the midterm curse, which is basically that the president's party almost always loses the midterms. And there are a number of theories for why this is. Generally, it's kind of some combination of it's a backlash against the president's policies and just kind of a general sense that, the grass is greener on the other side. You also could have kind of disproportionate turnout. Usually, so presidential races are very high turnout and the midterms aren't as high turnout. And usually the people who are motivated to vote in the midterms are the people who dislike the current president rather than the people who like them, because just kind of hatred is a stronger motivation than love. And so, that can kind of create, if in this case, more Republicans might vote than Democrats, although the Supreme Court's decision on abortion did seem to motivate Democrats to the point where the race is more competitive, I think, than it normally would be. But yeah, so basically the upshot is that since World War II, the president's party has lost an average of 26 House seats in every midterm election, and only twice has the president's party gained seats. And so you're in this position where basically the president has 2 years to do things, and that's if they're lucky, right? If the president was elected and they were able to sweep in a Senate and House of their own party, which, of course, again, because the president is not the prime minister, those two things aren't necessarily tied together. Then you have this 2-year window, as Joe Biden did, to kind of make policies with your own party and pass things. But then at the midterm elections, you are probably going to lose that majority in at least one chamber. And that's going to be probably the case with the House this year. And so then you're kind of left with this 2-year period of where you're just kind of twiddling your thumbs, and, the president can take executive action, but otherwise you're going to have to strike compromises if you want to do, pass any policies, and certainly even basic things like passing the budget, or we have the debt ceiling in the U.S., which basically you have to ask permission to borrow more money for the government. And this kind of always leads to kind of like a standoff between Democrats and Republicans, especially when the parties have to share power. And it's not a great system if you're not a fan of gridlock. And obviously, as soon as 2022 is over, people are going to start looking forward to the next presidential election. You might have Donald Trump announce that he's running again for president. You'll probably see Joe Biden clarify his plans in the coming months. So I think a lot of the next 2 years is not going to be a lot of policymaking and more a lot of just kind of politicking, looking forward to the next presidential election.
For election nerds in Canada, there's always discussions about electoral reform, things like that. Is there ever any serious discussion about changing the system in the United States?
Yeah, I think there is, but it's obviously very complicated when you have 50 different election systems, right? Mm. So, Democrats had a bill that they proposed back in, I think it was 2019, after they took control of the House during Donald Trump's presidency. And then they tried to pass it when Joe Biden became president. But it failed. But it was basically a law that would liberalize voting procedures around the country. It would do things like, require early voting and absentee voting, and just generally kind of make it easier to vote all around the country, to have kind of like a baseline of rules. But even that wouldn't kind of federalize elections the way that you guys have in Canada, which is something that is a total third rail. People scream bloody murder whenever anybody kind of brings up the idea that there should be a federal agency running elections. But also on the state level, you've seen more success, right? So a couple of states, so Maine and Alaska, have switched to ranked choice voting systems, which is interesting. So it works slightly differently in each state, but folks probably know, because this is a nerdy podcast, that ranked choice voting, there are 4 candidates on the ballot, and you say, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice, this is my fourth choice, and then the candidates are kind of eliminated based on the fewest votes, and then it kind of those votes are reallocated based on the second and third choices until somebody has a majority. And so in a state, actually Maine and Alaska are both states where kind of independents and third parties are fairly strong. And so, those are states that have had issues in the past where maybe, 2 candidates who are ideologically similar have split the vote and, let a candidate slip by with the minority of the vote. And so, the ranked choice voting system, they're still relatively new in both states, but they seem to be doing kind of their intended purpose of kind of making sure the candidate with kind of true majority support gets elected. And then other kind of smaller changes on the state level. Well, I shouldn't say small, but some states have moved to vote by mail systems since the pandemic in particular, and of course that can raise turnout. Other states have cracked down on voting, particularly Republican states. After kind of the false claims of voter fraud in 2020, in terms of adding more requirements for voter ID, restricting mail voting, and stuff like that. So I would say that on the state level, kind of ideas for election reform are. The laboratories of democracy, as states are often referred to, are kind of popping and bubbling and doing their thing. But in terms of the federal government, I think it's going to be hard to get any action there.
You mentioned the cases of Maine and Alaska where you do have almost multi-party races. Does that suggest then that the system that's in place in the rest of the country is what is making the system just a two-party system in the United States versus the multi-party system we have here?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question that political scientists debate, right? I think Canada obviously also has a first past the post system, and you guys are able to sustain multiple parties. So I do tend to think that the system isn't really what is kind of causing the polarization and the two-party system. I think it is ultimately what voters want. Most of polarization is voters kind of identifying with their tribe and hating the other side. But a system like ranked choice voting in states like Maine and Alaska, where partisanship is relatively weak, I think can mitigate that somewhat. But for example, in Alaska, we just had a by-election essentially where Sarah Palin, who folks might remember was the 2008 Republican vice presidential nominee, who is pretty far right. She's a Trump ally now. She came within a few points of winning, even in that ranked choice election. So it's not a panacea. But she may have won under kind of a traditional system. So who knows?
Right. And just one last kind of point of comparison I wanted to discuss just a little bit was the decentralization a little bit of politics. Now, you mentioned earlier that, the national environment you think is the overriding thing, but, who is the leader of the Republican Party right now, right? That is a question that would be up for debate. Whereas here, the leader of the Conservative Party is obviously Pierre Poilievre. There are these brands that have a hierarchy, but it doesn't seem like that's the case in the United States, because Joe Biden is sort of the leader of the Democratic Party, but is he actually identified as that? Because you can have almost some candidates running against, the Washington, D.C. Democrats kind of thing. So what impact do you think that has on American politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. People don't really think about it I guess the leader of the Democratic Party is Joe Biden, and the Republican Party doesn't really have a leader, but that doesn't really matter. We just don't think about it in those terms. It is interesting though, that you will see campaigns kind of try to strategically tie themselves or their opponent to certain figures, basically de facto leaders in the party, when it is kind of politically expedient for them to do so. So, for example, Joe Biden, who is fairly unpopular, I think his approval rating is at 43% in the FiveThirtyEight average. He's showing up a lot in Republican ads because you might have a Democratic candidate like John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, who is relatively popular himself, but Joe Biden isn't popular in Pennsylvania. So the Republican ads will try to tie Fetterman to Biden and remind people that, he'll be a rubber stamp for Biden or whatever. This is actually when FiveThirtyEight gets the most famous, because one of our metrics, one of our kind of lesser known metrics, is we have a thing called Biden score. And during the Trump administration, we had Trump score, which is basically, it's very simple. It's just how often members of Congress vote the party line, in their votes in Congress. And this shows up every 2 years in campaign ads, because Democrats will say, so-and-so Republican voted 100% of the time with Donald Trump, citation FiveThirtyEight. And you see that a lot this year with Joe Biden, people saying how often they vote with, the Democratic candidate votes with Joe Biden. Nancy Pelosi is another big figure, being the Speaker of the House for Democrats right now. She's very unpopular nationally, even more so than Joe Biden. So that's another person you'll kind of see Republicans try to be like, Nancy Pelosi is the de facto leader of the Democratic Party because you're voting for the House, and she's going to be the leader there. On the flip side, of course, it's Donald Trump for Republicans who is also unpopular nationally. Democrats love to tie Republicans to Donald Trump. Even, some Republicans who are from the kind of Republican Party of old, maybe the George W. Bush type of Republicans, and maybe they're not like thrilled with the fact that Donald Trump has taken over the party, but they haven't been like a Liz Cheney, for example, and kind of actively stood up and like all but left the party as a result of it. And so you'll see people, Democratic ads say this person is like Trump, and especially in kind of like light blue districts, which has been a lot of where the battleground is this year as the Republicans try to kind of gain ground, districts that may have voted for Joe Biden but could conceivably go red in this election. The Democrats are saying, remember Donald Trump, who you voted against? Well, this person would be a rubber stamp for them.
We'll do the last point of comparison here. Our election's decided usually in a couple hours. The networks can call it. So what's going to happen on Tuesday night? I assume we won't know necessarily the winner, the quote unquote winner of the election on Tuesday night.
Yeah, oh man, the bane of my existence. So I think it'll be better than it was in 2020, when I'm sure everyone remembers it took until Saturday after the Tuesday to declare Joe Biden the winner. But yeah, because every state counts its votes on its own, and they all have different rules for it. So some states, and they have different rules of how they cast ballots, right? So some states are all mail states, and other states are almost all in-person states, and mail ballots take longer to count than in-person votes. And so a state like Alabama that votes in person is going to be done on election night. A state like Arizona that votes mostly by mail is going to take several days. And then also some states just just make it easier on election officials. So like a state like Florida allows votes to, like, absentee ballots to be cast or counted, I think something like 2 or 3 weeks before election day. The results aren't announced early, but kind of they're run through the machines and they're ready to go. So as soon as polls close, they can report all of those results. And then once they add it to the election day votes a couple hours later, they're basically done. Whereas states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, which of course are key swing states that have a lot of interest in people knowing their results, they don't allow absentee votes to be counted until the day of the election. And in 2020, when there were a ton of those votes, that's why you saw these counts take days. This year, obviously, the pandemic is much diminished, if not over. And so mail voting is expected to decrease from 2020. But also a lot of people, I think, really liked the convenience of mail voting and discovered, hey, I'm going to do this more often going forward. So I think you're going to see a level of mail voting that's between 2018 and 2020, which means that we'll basically be somewhere in the middle of those two in terms of when we know the results. So my kind of what I've been saying is that I think the House, because it's so clearly going to go to Republicans, that should be known on Tuesday night. A lot of gubernatorial races will be known on Tuesday night, not all of them. But the Senate, because states like Pennsylvania and Arizona and Nevada are some of these slower counting states, I would expect that we probably won't know who won the Senate until Wednesday or maybe Thursday.
Okay. Well, that's not Saturday. So
right, exactly.
That is an improvement.
I can live with it.
All right. Well, I know it's a really busy time for you, so I really appreciate you taking time to talk to this Canadian podcast about American politics. So, Nathaniel Rakich, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Eric. It was a pleasure.